totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to the Booked on Rock podcast. Before we get to this episode's guest, a quick thank you to everyone who has subscribed to the Booked on Rock podcast. If you haven't subscribed yet, just head over to the website bookedonrock.com. You can find all the major platforms where you can subscribe, and give the podcast a 5-star review if you can too, because that helps get the podcast out to more people. And to everyone who has given the podcast all these great reviews, can't thank you enough. Got another interesting interview for you. Adam Steiner, he is our guest to talk about his book, Into the Never, 9 Inch Nails, and the creation of the Downward Spiral, which is out now through Backbeat Books. Ushering in a new era of confessional music that spoke openly about experiences of trauma, depression, and self-loathing, 9 Inch Nails' seminal album 1994's The Downward Spiral changed popular music forever, bringing transgressive themes of heresy, S&M, and body horror to the masses, and taking music technology to its limits. When the album was released in '94, it resonated across a generation, combining elements of metal, industrial, synth-pop, and ambient electronica, and going on to sell over 4 million copies. Now, Into the Never explores the creation and cultural impact of the Downward Spiral, one of the most influential and artistically significant albums of the 20th century. Inspired by David Bowie's Low and Pink Floyd's The Wall, the album recounts one man's disintegration as he descends into nihilism and nothingness. Blurring the lines between autobiography and concept album, creation and decay, it's also the story of Trent Reznor as he pushed himself to the edge of the abyss, trapped in a cycle of addiction and self-destruction. The Downward Spiral also presents a reflection of America and a wider culture of violence, connecting the Columbine High School shooting, the infamous Manson family murders, and the aftermath of Vietnam and the Gulf War. Featuring new interviews with collaborators and artists inspired by the album, Into the Never sets the Downward Spiral in the context of music of the era and brings the story up to date, from Reznor's recovery to his reinvention as an Oscar-winning soundtrack artist. Adam Steiner studied philosophy at the University of Aberdeen and writes about music, street art culture, architecture, and transgressive fiction. He released his first novel in 2018 titled Politics of the Asylum. He joins us from his home in London. To hear all of the 9 Inch Nails album, The Downward Spiral, head over to the show notes page. Adam, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Hello, thank you for having me.
You write that the album, The Downward Spiral, is a difficult album to explain or examine, equally defying and demanding further questions. It has to be heard in order to be understood. And while it offers the listener no definite answers, this frictive challenge makes it all the more compelling. When did you first hear this album in its entirety, and what was your first reaction to it?
That's a great question to start off. I was, I believe, 15 or 16. I was in what we would call college here in the UK. So that's like sixth form. So you're like 18 to 20 before you go to university, what you guys call college. And I think a friend lent it to me and recommended it to me because I was listening at the time to a lot of Manic Street Preachers, which comes across a lot in the book, obviously, and a lot of other things like Faith No More's Angel Dust. So kind of like early 90s albums from that era that have a similar worldview, should we say. And yeah, I think someone lent it to me, and so I listened to it all the way through, and afterwards I was just kind of stunned. I thought I haven't really listened to or heard anything quite like this before. So it's an album of songs, but it also seems like textural, atmospheric, mood music, almost like movie sound effect things going on as well. So it was completely different to anything I'd heard before. All fair to say, I don't think I've really heard anything quite like it since.
Yeah, and it's no surprise Trent eventually gets into movie songwriting because it's very atmospheric.
Yeah.
You know? Pink Floyd's The Wall, considered the greatest concept album of all time, and Trent was heavily inspired by that double album, particularly the alienation between the artist and the audience. And he did have an interesting comment on one of the tracks from The Downward Spiral, which is March of Pigs, and we'll get to that a little bit more. But as far as that quote, he basically alludes to the same feeling. Something intimate that he writes is now being heard by millions of people, and now they're yelling the lyrics back at him in concert. And that made him feel more lonely than before.
Yeah, I think it's a strange thing about particularly with music and rock music, is that you start from nowhere, like Trent was doing, working at the Right Track Studios, initially as a cleaner and then as an engineer, and using the studio downtime, like, the kind of midnight dawn shift, non-shift, that kind of time to make his demos for Pretty Hate Machine. So coming from nowhere and working all by himself, doing everything. And then to go to someone where people actually want to give you a record deal, and then you're performing in small clubs or venues and just trying to get out there, just trying to make it. Maybe you're getting beer money, maybe you're getting nothing, maybe you're just getting bottled by the audience. And then you're going up to, arenas or stadiums and that kind of thing. And to have it happen to you relatively quickly, like it did with the second proper album, and then obviously again years later with The Fragile, I think must be quite a scary, exciting, exhilarating, mind-blowing experience. And like having the psychological armor to deal with that kind of thing, I don't think it comes from nowhere. Nothing can really prepare you for it, because you never know what your particular version of fame will be like. Some people pursue it, some people want it, they want to be a celebrity alongside their music. But even if you're just about the music, you can't help but get caught up in some kind of media storm. And obviously, it's the mass crowd effect of fans, people that want and expect or come to expect so much from you, and then in a certain way. And it's that classic joke that everyone makes where it's like, I really like the early stuff. And it's like, you feel it, because as a fan and as a first listener, to something like The Downward Spiral, you might not have heard Pretty Hate Machine first. You were there, like you feel at the start, and you were there from the ground up, and you kind of helped make the band what it was, and you supported them, and you went to the shows and everything. Then when things change down the line and the artist changes as a person, and things happen in their life, and you can also be blunt and say they grow up, and you grow up alongside them, it's sometimes jarring to think that they might not be the same person or the same musician as what you loved them for at the start. But that's a lot to ask of anyone.
You mentioned Pretty Hate Machine, which is the first Nine Inch Nails album from 1989. And it's interesting because the younger generation, their thought is getting famous, making lots of money equals happiness. And as the artists who do become rich and famous find, it's actually more alienating. And then there's the downward spiral. I think that's where this album comes from in Trent's mind, right? Because he had these songs and the thoughts and the lyrics about how he wanted it to sound in his head before he even started writing the music.
Yes, and it's ironic, isn't it? Like you say, it's the second album proper. I think for terms of categorization, we'll say Broken's a mini album or a double EP or something crazy like that. It's a halo. It's all good. But the Downward Spiral, it's only the second album, and he's already having those kind of thoughts and feelings, because obviously Pretty Hate Machine wasn't a hit, but it sold pretty respectably. I think it was like, it got to like 250,000 copies or so, and the singles did quite well, certainly in the alternative charts and in the clubs. And it was the transition of industrial music, and then people taking elements from that, like Nine Inch Nails did, and it becoming a slightly overground crossover thing in rock music in general for a brief time. But yeah, I think that to happen on your second album is really strange. If we look at The Wall, it's 1970.
79, yeah. Which is interesting because sometimes people rank it among 1980s greatest albums because it kind of bled into the following year. But yeah, 1979.
It definitely has a bit of the 80s to it. It's a bit like Bowie's Lodger, actually, sort of predicting, the decade to come. That's another story. Like by the time Pink Floyd were doing The Wall, they'd done so much anyway. They'd been around forever. And in the 60s with Syd Barrett, and they'd had their super huge, massive success in 72 with Dark Side of the Moon, and things only grew exponentially from there. Wish You Were Here, and then Animals. But yeah, like they'd had a huge career. So no wonder they were jaded, or Roger Waters was jaded and worn out and like, I'm a stadium band and I'm trapped playing the hits and so on. And yeah, for Reznor to have that so early on without necessarily having the huge fame, it was the Downward Spiral that made that happen. And obviously the singles like Closer, to a lesser extent Hurt, until much later on. But, just the album in general, it really made them big, and the appearance at Lollapalooza and so on. And then later Woodstock, those things all like made the band bigger each time. It was a big jump up. So it's an interesting thing to think, if you wanted to put the brakes on, but you want to keep making music and your music is popular and increasingly popular, what else can you do? So it seems to have happened prematurely, but perhaps that's part of the way in which it's more of a concept album. He was saying, I feel I'm about to get famous, or I'm going to go up to another plateau. And I think this is what it might feel like, and this is what's going to happen. So I don't know, maybe he was just particularly sensitive to those kind of things that were going on around him.
Well, let's get into the theme of this album. And there are three broad phases to it that you say support the observation that this is someone who is in a downward spiral. Can you talk about that?
So it's not quite the 7 circles of hell, but it literally has the kind of, even though it's a spiral metaphor, it has the crazy trajectory thing. And it's about, starting out feeling uncertain, unsure, alienated, isolated, lonely, and then things tipping over into a kind of megalomaniac phase where it's particularly in the middle of the album, like tracks like Closer and Ruiner, where it all becomes ego driven and self-absorbed and obsessive and compulsive. So that's where the addictive tendencies seem to shine through on the album. Even though I believe at the time, Reznor wasn't actually having so many difficulties. It was in the ensuing years, and certainly within like the release and the touring of The Fragile, that he said that really became a problem, and he hated touring and playing music and doing music because it was all associated with the challenges of addiction. But perhaps those initial seeds were there in the record, and then it kind of ends essentially with a crash or a gradual dying off. And it's this difficult non-resolution where people say, well, it's a concept album and the narrative is that the guy kills himself at the end, or he feels he came close to death and he survived, or he spiritually dies and is reborn. I mean, I'm not throwing these out there as absolute answers, but, in terms of it being a straight story, there's a fair bit of uncertainty and strangeness there. So we never quite get to the bottom of it. And I enjoy that as a work of art, that there is that element of uncertainty, that we're not given answers. We're allowed our creative impulses to take over and imagination to take up some of that empty space. And it's kind of, I guess it's kind of how you feel it. I mean, that's a great thing to say for a record, I think.
There's also the 3 Trent Reznors, the man, the persona, and the narrator that we hear throughout this album. And this, you say, helps us to understand what we hear throughout this album. Yeah,
sure. I mean, it's down to his personal experiences, which I referred to earlier, and what he was going through at the time. And then the persona of the leader of Nine Inch Nails, S&M fetish gear, clad in leather, trying to push this harsh aesthetic, having black hair. I believe he dies. I'm not sure. That then grows into, a longer, like rockier kind of haircut. And him as the leader of the band, even though effectively the band, so to speak, is him as a one-man unit. Trent Reznor is Nine Inch Nails. And playing up to, I guess, a lot of audience expectations, and obviously being the performer and, on stage, putting yourself into that place. And then maybe after the performance, going back into you, the normal person, and experiencing some of the come down of that, which obviously is where, for a lot of people, I think certainly in music, addiction kind of fills the void of after the voices have stopped and after the excitement is over and you're still buzzing and trying to replicate that euphoria. You're actually trying to find a consistent level, but it's so heightened that you have to use whatever to try and get there. And that can be obviously a lot of addictive things to fill that void. And so the narrator obviously is, the guy, or the voice rather, driving, or the voices driving the story through the album. And it's so confusing and so strange. And I often kind of felt like it's like a person having an argument with themselves, but sometimes the voices seem so extreme and so malevolent. It doesn't seem that you could contain all those, one person could contain all those crazy contrasting emotional states of self-loathing and hate and alienation, but then also to be so, should we say, outgoing and purposeful and driven and I guess you could say enthusiastic, but in a bad way. Someone who's so compulsive and consumed by appetites and things. I mean, Reznor talked a lot about that. The person, it's not just about drugs and sex and things. It's like someone who's, looking for perhaps communion and connection with other people, desperately not wanting to be alone, like a Kurt Cobain type figure, who became very, very isolated as his life went on and became more famous, but also like searching for religion and, trying to find some deeper spiritual meaning in their life. But obviously the album has such a harsh critique of religion. So I guess that's something that was explored or approached, but found wanting, and also found to be something to deride and to attack, something that was hostile or anathema to their way of being in the world. So it's really difficult to see how any of those things worked out for the narrator in the story of the album. And I guess that's why it leads down such an inexorable dark path.
It was released March 8th of 1994, recorded over the period of 1992 and 1993 at a very well-known location, 10050 Cielo Drive in Los Angeles, one of the most infamous locations in American history. This is where the Manson family murders took place in August of 1969. Sharon Tate was murdered there, among others. He called the first night there terrifying, but then describes the view of Los Angeles from the front door as being beautiful. And I thought that was interesting, the dichotomy, the two sides of this location. But yeah, how did he wind up recording there?
Yeah, so basically he tells it as quite a straight story. I mean, the common understanding is that ultimately he quickly realized or knew or found out that it was that place. And later on, he kind of had to play it down a bit. It's like, oh, I didn't quite realize it was that house. I mean, he says he viewed like 15 places in a day. You fly over to LA because he was doing work in, oh God, I forget the studio now. I think it's in Miami or something. But it's a lot of work on Broken and stuff. And so you fly into LA and stuff. And, he's from like Ohio and so on, and based in Cleveland largely. So he goes into LA, find an estate agent. I need a house, big house to rent, not a normal studio. I build my home studio in there. I've got the support of Interscope and Jimmy Iovine, and I'm going to get like a really good setup there, custom built, how I want it to be. And I'm record at my own pace, my own time, which is really, valuable thing to have, certainly in that era as well. Level of like artistic control and independence, but also to kind of like freeform the creation of the album. So looking like 15 places in a day, and he's like, well, this place seems pretty good. This is pretty nice. And I believe it was relatively expensive, but obviously he had a good budget behind him and he had the support of the label. There's a lot of belief there and the potential for what he could do next. And he's like, yeah, this seems like a good place as any. And it's the question of whether the estate agent would keep that stuff on the down low, because he doesn't want him to know that it's a notorious murder house and that might freak him out. Or if the estate agent possibly drops it as a lurid detail, like maybe this will pique your interest because he sees the kind of guy Trent Reznor is. And, who knows? And I don't think there's necessarily a crime in, recording an album in the house. What's ironic is obviously the kind of stuff and the kind of music that he was making. You want to say the house had a direct effect on the album, but you also want to say that the two things kind of like fed into one another. So perhaps Reznor was doing really dark work there, and it seemed like a strange, eerie, weird coincidence. And maybe there's some meaning behind that, depending on what you believe or want to read into it.
Well,
but I think
many of us are fascinated with the paranormal, so I wonder what went on inside there.
Sure.
I wonder if Trent's got some stories he hasn't told.
He talked a bit in some interviews about ghost noises and stuff. And
he did? Okay, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, briefly. And I think Chris Brenner mentioned it as well, his collaborator. And there's this weird mention of like Tori Amos came over because they'd become friends and they were trying to cook some chicken and the chicken wouldn't cook and it took hours and hours and it remained raw. And I was like, that's kind of cute, but I don't know if that really needs to be in the book. And I also just thought, like, what's the source on this? Yeah. Like, is this confirmed? This sounds like gibberish. I wouldn't blame anyone for picking it up. It probably came from somewhere, maybe just from Tori Amos and stuff and whatever. And they couldn't work the oven. I'm sure there's a rational explanation for everything, but it's just this thing about the house that has such a strong cachet. And the two things, seemed to kind of chime and work together in the end. So it's a strange coincidence, but I think there's also some meaning to it. And the fact was that, he got a lot of house for the money. It's this expansive bungalow. So it was really useful for him to be there.
And it's since been destroyed, but he did take the door with him, I think, right?
There's a great long story about the door. I won't go into it all now, but long story short, he bought the former funeral home in New Orleans in, I think, like 97 or something, and set up that as his new base of operations. And he installed the new door there. So the Cielo Drive door that had the pig's blood on it that had been painted over. And then eventually he sold the studio building there a few years back and moved to LA proper. And I believe he left the door there, and some guy came and bought the door. So this guy now owns the door somewhere. The door's out there in the ether. So there's a Sharon Tate, Cielo Drive, Manson door collector guy.
So that door, it's a mystery now where that door is?
Yeah, it's literally a portal. It can just be a metaphor. It can just float out there as, a door to nowhere or somewhere terrible.
You're right, yeah. Before we get to the tracks here, real quickly, the album cover to The Downward Spiral, it is a work called Wound, and it's by British artist Russell Mills. And he was told not to make anything that looked like the previous Nine Inch Nails artwork. And they gave him some key words to work from: attrition, decay, organic, uncertainty, lost dreams, broken promises, and temptations. That's quite a list to work off of, but I think, he really came through on this album cover.
Yeah, I mean, that should have been the keywords on the album search, right? That's like, you don't need to write a review for the record. That's just it. It's an incredible piece of work. And Russell Mills is a very interesting guy. I wasn't able to interview him, unfortunately. I couldn't actually track him down because I don't think he's so proactive in the art world these days, like exhibiting and having an agent and stuff. But he did a lot of other interesting work, and he did the artwork Hesitation Marks, which is also really good. And you can see that as an evolution and an advance of the Wound piece as well. But yeah, he's a very interesting artist. And I found some other interviews with him down the line. I'm just like a guy who doesn't just do a painting or a textural sculpture, should we say. He really puts a lot of thought into ideas and concepts and things that you would never have realized unless you had dug deep and read about them. So he really, he's really serious about his artwork. It's really impressive.
Perfect guy to pick, because obviously Trent was serious about his work too. And let's get to the tracks now. The opening track is Mr. Self-Destruct. And as you write, it's a powerful introduction to the album. Starts with a sample from a George Lucas film, his first film, in fact, and it's called TXH 1138 from 1971. What is the significance of this sample to the song?
Oh, good question. Literally, it's your classic dystopia film, so very similar to like 1984, but then advance into a slightly more futuristic setting. But essentially, it's about these guys watching a hologram of a prisoner being beaten by a guard. And it's just quite a powerful piece of footage because it takes a long time. So the sound of it and the experience of watching it and not being able to look away because the camera continues goes on for quite a while. And obviously the sample, Reznor seems to use most of that shot or that scene before he even gets into his song. So it's quite discomforting to sit through, and you're waiting for music, so to speak, to kick in, guitars, drums, whatever, synth. And you're just sitting through a person being beaten by a guard with a truncheon. And it continues and it continues and it gets heavier and heavier. And it doesn't necessarily get much faster, but it just becomes more intense and a bit more frenzied and a bit more like double beating. Like it's like the person's losing control as they're trying to hit someone. So there's a really weird like exchange there in the power dynamic of like the person's losing control, but they still have ownership of the other person's body as they're just beating them black and blue.
Pain and pleasure. Basically, the track is taking the listener in a controlling position of pain and pleasure.
That's a really interesting point, actually. And it's like the guard seems to be taking pleasure in their work, right? And it's the fact that the thing goes on too long. It's unrestrained. It's no longer about punishing someone for something they did. It's gone beyond into something else that's completely out of control. It's very strange.
There's a surprise guest who appears during the bridge of this song, too. Adrian Belew, the legendary Adrian Belew, former King Crimson, David Bowie guitarist. The project he had just finished working on was very different.
Yeah, he was working on Paul Simon's Graceland. He's a really interesting, broad guitarist. He worked with so many different people at different times. And I think he worked with Trent Reznor again down the line, and also with Talking Heads at one point. But yeah, he was on, a really poppy album about the emancipation of South Africa, from apartheid, and then sort of got a call and flew over to LA and then into this weird house and adding a load of I think it's referred to as like modulating guitars, but it's like loads of like guitar textures. So I don't know if you can really pick out exactly what parts are Belew. There's some crazy like riffing, noodling kind of in the background at points, and I assume that's him, but I've never heard it explicitly stated. And then he's there on, I think, a couple more tracks, but very much in the background, which is really interesting. It's like Robert Fripp with Bowie. Sometimes it's about more like ambient guitar work rather than straight out rock and roll riffing. So that's really interesting to hear.
Track 2, this is a mystery, I believe, to this day as to what it refers to, but there are theories because of where this was recorded, the album. It's titled Piggy. Mm-hmm. That makes people think of course, the Manson murders. They wrote Piggy on the door. So sure. Who the song refers to and what is the meaning? Still debated. What are some of the theories? And what do you think it's about?
The chief, I guess the core theory is that it broadly refers to someone who was close to Trent Reznor, potentially a partner or lover or a close friend who they then became distant from. So the track's kind of like a kiss off to that person, a harsh goodbye, but also perhaps an exposure of, I cared about you, I potentially care about you still, but it's difficult for me to admit it and it's painful to separate from that person. And I think it's generally believed to refer to Richard Patrick, who was guitarist with Nine Inch Nails, mainly touring during the early days, would go on to form the band Filter, and he basically broke away from the Downward Spiral process, mainly because the manager, I believe it's John Malm of Nine Inch Nails, informed him that when he contributed stuff to the record, even if he perhaps wrote a song, he wouldn't own it. So he might have a songwriting credit, but he'd probably end up sharing it with Reznor, and it wouldn't be his song in terms of final publishing rights. So he basically wasn't happy with that, and just removed himself from the thing and went off and did his own work, which is probably a really good thing for everyone, really healthy, sensible thing to do. But the theory is that Piggy is Reznor essentially saying goodbye to a former bandmate and colleague who was there in the earliest, probably most, should we say, difficult times of when a band is just getting started and trying to break through.
One of my favorite bands is The Cure, and Trent's a big fan of early Cure music, and you make note of the crash cymbals from their 1982 album Pornography.
Yeah.
It makes an appearance on this track.
For me personally, it's almost like it could be a sample. Like Pornography is such a great record. It's so intense and so dark, and you can kind of hear because of things like that, that's kind of how we end up with bands like Nine Inch Nails and albums like Downward Spiral. But it just has these really intense crash cymbals and I think wave cymbals that are just like really big and deep sounds. And it's sort of like a gong, but it's more fierce and more rattled. And it just keeps going and going and going. And towards the close of the track, Reznor basically does a drum solo. He said that he was trying to experiment to do the most broken, brutal drumming that he could. Bear in mind that he's not really a drummer. He's, classically trained pianist. So he can turn his hand to pretty much anything. But he was like, I'll have a crack at the drums. And in the end, he said the take was shitty and I try and sabotage the song. So he's sort of in time at the start, and then he goes completely out of time and keeps on doing his own thing, and he's banging the cymbals. And it just becomes this like self-destructive thing of like breaking down the song at the end, and the drums just take over. And it's just like a really interesting thing of a musician going freestyle and in the end having like no regard for the backing track and taking the atmosphere of the song in a different direction.
The similarities with Pornography and the Downward Spiral, for me anyway, is both albums get better the more you listen to it. Because Pornography, I became a Cure fan through their hit singles, the upbeat songs, Just Like Heaven. And listening to Pornography for the first time, I was a little taken aback, like, this isn't, I mean, I love Disintegration, love the dark side of The Cure, but those songs had a little more of a pop sensibility to them. Pornography is just, that's hardcore dark stuff. And it, just listening to it within the last few years, I'm appreciating it more. So, and I get that with Downward Spiral. The biggest difference, though, was that for the Downward Spiral, there was a hit single. Pornography, I don't think it had any hit singles off of that. So I think that's what helped this album to sell so many copies. But Trent was surprised by the commercial success of the Downward Spiral. He didn't see that one coming at all. Talking with Adam Steiner, author of Into the Never, 9 Inch Nails, and the Creation of the Downward Spiral. Religion enters the storyline with the track Heresy. The narrator's increasing disillusionment manifests as a loss of faith and trust in other people. Trent was raised by his grandparents from around the age of 5 or 6 after his parents' divorce. So what type of religious upbringing did he have growing up? You mentioned he grew up in I think it was Pennsylvania, right?
A town called Mercer.
Mercer, Pennsylvania.
So like small, normal Midwestern town, very typical, nothing particularly remarkable about it. And I believe his upbringing wasn't necessarily strict. It was just very much conformist, normal, like everyone else in the town, very regular. And so that in itself, for some people, a strict kind of, or a relative orthodoxy can be quite constrictive because they're not necessarily encouraged into other things. But I think he said it was really positive upbringing and so on. Yeah, you don't necessarily expect the anger and the vehemence against religion to rise up as it does. But I mean, with Heresy, I think Reznor's basically arguing against blind religious conformity, what you sometimes see as the herd mentality of people conforming to all doctrines or aspects of religion, certainly reading into Bible as the main Christian text too literally, and then taking that as gospel, if you will, into their daily lives and how they expect other people to be in the world, and also how they expect laws to be formed and enforced. So I think he saw a lot of hypocrisy in that, in terms of Christian dogma too strictly informing principles of government. So I guess when you look at like the Reagan era, very conservative, Republican, and you expect some of that from Republican governments and offices, but not necessarily to be quite far right and to be very, very conservative and restrictive. So to put Christian values ahead of perhaps contemporary society values. So one way in which this particularly manifested was around obviously the growing HIV and AIDS crisis from the early 80s and then into the mid 80s, where it was sometimes blamed upon as being the gay disease and punishment from God for people for practicing homosexuality. So I think he found those kind of principles that were sometimes expressed by some people who are particularly religious to be hypocritical and wrong. And so this is kind of his like raging scourge against that.
He borrows the infamous phrase from Nietzsche, God is dead. Why do you think he uses that in the song?
It's a slightly misunderstood line, I think, as in people often take it very literally that there is no God. But I think the way it's more broadly understood is that God is dead in terms of if there is a God, so to speak, he has no direct power over us on earth. So we can choose to reject religion and certainly fundamentalist religion and religious orthodoxies and teachings and ways in which we behave in society and rules that we adhere to, seemingly without consequence. So you may obviously, in principle, burn in hell, etc. But God doesn't have literal determinist power over human beings in their daily lives. And I guess that depends upon how strictly you read the Bible and so on. But I think he's basically saying he's calling the bluff on the thought experiment of faith. So when he's saying God is dead, if there is a hell, I'll see you there, I think he's basically evoking the challenge of prove me wrong. And if I do happen to be wrong, then I'll suffer for it in some afterlife that you've told me is inevitably going to happen to me. But in terms of real life here now in the world and the choices I make and the ways in which I behave towards other people, God is not directly affecting or controlling my actions. I'm making choices for and against that.
And nothing's unintentional with him, so he's not even just saying it. He's belting it out. When he's saying God is dead, he is screaming it.
It's a very extreme position, but within the context of the song, the narrator's voice, whatever, it's there and it's put across loud and clear. It's unequivocal, right?
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. The Booked on Rock podcast is online at bookedonrock.com. Find a list of all the major platforms where you can listen and subscribe to the podcast. Link up to our social media sites. Find out the latest Books on Rock releases. Find your nearest bookstore. And if you want to reach out to us, you can contact us through our website, bookedonrock.com. You talked about his ability to play the piano on March of the Pigs. He's got some nice piano work here. You write that it's a fantastic paranoid mess. A beat clocking in at 269 beats per minute in 7/8 time signature, the fastest 9-inch nail song ever recorded, and perhaps the most explosive. Talk about this song a little bit. What is Trent trying to say here with this track?
I think in fairness, it's like the dynamism of the song is rooted in the crazy intense drumming that really holds everything together. And then obviously the guitar, the two of them kind of like jousting off of each other and keeping the whole thing together. Because obviously when you've got a really fast song that is also in a slightly weird time signature, it's really hard to hold it all together. And, that seems to be another one of those crowd fear, fame shock kind of songs, and Trent revolting and reacting against that. But I think, the power of the song is that it seems to like be self-destructive against itself. It shouldn't work, but it does. And it has those weird electronic elements. And as you say, that you hear the really smooth jazz bar lounge, hotel lounge piano creep into the verses as the little breaks. And doesn't it make you feel better? Pause, breath, just before you can have one clear thought to yourself, boom, the song jumps back in again. So it's really intense, really powerful, and really jarring. And it's almost like he's being ironic with the piano playing, but I guess he's making a point of, I can do all these things. I can do both. I can do something that is almost croony, schmaltzy, Elton John style, and then break into something really extreme and heavy with guitars. Like
Jonathan Gold said, Rolling Stones, Jonathan Gold, he's playing the soft, loud game, and he's taking it to sadistic extremes. This is, sonically, this song, the album, is just brilliant. His approach to sound, how it connects to the themes of each song. It's like, I hear these songs and it's like connecting tissues throughout, both sonically and lyrically. It's like a collage. It's a really fascinating approach to it. Again, it's not individual songs track by track. Like you say, you got to listen to it from start to finish. It's a body of work. It's really fascinating. Where did that come? Where do you think that came from, that musical mind of his? What was he listening to growing up?
I know that, like I said, he had lessons, and I think he maybe played in the school band for a bit. So he basically had some, relatively formal musical training, as opposed to I picked up a 6-string acoustic and just taught myself chords off the Beatles, that kind of thing. So I guess he was much more ingrained in theory than most people would be at the beginning of their musical career from being a teenager. And then like things he was listening to, obviously, like we talked about The Wall, he was a big fan. I believe he was quite into Kiss as well in the early days. Not that you can really tell, but I guess sense of bombast and ambition perhaps is there from the start. And also The Cure's Head on the Door, I think he said, was his favorite Cure record, which I don't mind. It does have a lot of variation and tone in there and stuff, but it's really weird because like Pornography is 1982 and Head on the Door, I believe, is like 85. So it's quite a poppy era of The Cure, but it does have some other dimensions to it. But I think that's the one of his generation,
But
the album that was around.
But he does have a pop sensibility. He says Human League influenced him every bit as much as bands like Skinny Puppy and Ministry. So that's what's interesting there. He's combining the two.
Yeah.
Well, the track Closer, huge commercial success, number 41 on the Billboard Hot 100. You say it's not only the most chart-ready single from the album, but the most overtly controversial single from the Downward Spiral. And I love your line from the book. Closer is both playing to the mainstream and kicking against it. I don't think he's not sitting down he's not trying to write a hit single, but it's there. It's like Kurt Cobain, though, with Nirvana. He was a Beatles fan. He he had a sense of hooks and harmonies and things like that, whether he wanted to admit it or not. But what is Closer about?
Yes, broadly speaking, it's evoking like brass tacks. It's like, I want to fuck you like an animal. It's obviously evoking like raw sexual desire and impulse. But I guess more than that, it goes beyond the physical and becomes something more sensual. So I don't think it's as basic and brutish as it actually sounds. And like you said, pop sensibilities, it's a much slinkier, more dynamic song than people might allow for it. It's not particularly distorted or heavy or intense, but it just has a really strong groove to it, kind of like a disco, almost a disco kind of beat. And that carries the song through. And it just makes it really strong and interesting to listen to. And it's a Nine Inch Nails song you can actually dance to, you know, in a fashion.
It was misunderstood, though. Trent was frustrated by that, right? Misinterpreted as a lust anthem.
It's one of the most well-known / notorious songs, isn't it? And I think it's a really interesting calling card that they're not just a distorted, dark, heavy metal band. He could do something that was lighter, or at least worked in a different vein.
The track Ruiner might be the most pessimistic track on the album. I think you even write that in the book, right? The Ruiner it's a godlike image. People follow him blindly like cattle. They both admire and fear his presence, while others held under his gaze. Is there a person in particular you suspect Trent was thinking about when writing this track? Is it autobiographical? Is it a fictional character?
Oh, that's a great question, Eric.
Or is it somebody within him? Is it a part of his personality within himself?
Yeah, I was never sure. I mean, I wonder, like we were saying with heresy, it's like, you know, a fear and apprehension and mistrust of God, or all godlike figures, you know, that people should follow in his image, seems to be present there. I mean, there's
self-loathing throughout the album. So that's why I think maybe this is somebody inside of him that he's that he's trying to kill that person inside of him.
Yeah, I think you can definitely see it that way. And it's like perhaps the negative overbearing self, the voice inside your head that brings you down and controls you, perhaps pushes you back into addiction because it knows it tells you you're weak, or it tells you it's easier to give in, and you go with that. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I don't think it's ever fully resolved either within the song, but it certainly seems to be an aspect of the narrator or another voice within them that is both controlling and manipulating them, but also taking them to a place that they don't really trying to take them to a place that they don't really want to be anymore. And so they actually want to make a change from it. And perhaps that's where the first point of division in the album, you know, where like Ruiner is the sign that things have gone too far. And after that, the person wants things to be different and wants those voices to stop.
Yeah, he's giving up the fight. He's just giving into his urges, and things get darker from here on out. We get to that second half of the album and gets darker. Track 7 is The Becoming. The screams we hear in the beginning of this one are from a scene in the 1990 film Robot Jocks. A giant war robot piloted by a human falls onto a crowd of people. You write that this is a confessional partner track to the emotional and physical transmutations of the track Piggy and an upcoming track Reptile. Can you explain that some more?
Yeah, sure. I think it kind of bridges between the two. And I think it's sort of setting things up where there's a sense of transformation, or of it can be negative transformation. So the person is trying to shed some of the emotional load of Ruiner, or some of the negative constrictive feelings that are holding them back in their life. And the becoming is a sense in which they're perhaps becoming more than they are, or more the person that they're meant to be. But the shape in which that is supposed to take is not necessarily clear within the track. And I always heard it as like, from the mechanical clanking kind of sounds in the lyrics, in the music, and the sounds in the lyrics, that it just is the person being perhaps overcome by that need to change, and perhaps there's like a sense in which technology is overriding their life. I don't know if that's really valid in 1994, but just musically and everything, I think there's a really weird sort of cyborg element to it that fits into the industrial theme. But I don't know if that was necessarily the intent of the track. But I definitely felt like it really bridged over to something like Reptile, which is more about like natural metamorphosis and transformation into some kind of monster or creature.
This is the track that has the jazz drum pattern. It's looping over and over.
Yeah.
So that's indicative of the narrator's mindset. As you're right, a revolution of the mind, spinning round and round inside his head. He's screaming out, "Someone please listen to me." I mean, that's interesting in that it definitely connected with teenagers a lot. That's something teenagers can relate to. Just, can somebody listen to me? Can somebody understand what I'm thinking and feeling?
Yeah, it's an interesting distinction, isn't it? Like, we look back on it now as like reasonably mature adults, and it's the difference between someone listening to you but actually being heard as well.
Big Man with a Gun is not your favorite track from Nine Inch Nails. You say it doesn't add much to the album. Would it have been better off left off?
I maybe shoot myself in the foot here. Boom, boom. Whatever I say. I think it's fun. It's good in terms of it being a piece of thrash. And I think like something like March of the Pigs does that so much better in such a different way, that Big Man seems kind of unnecessary. And it's really weird. It's like Reznor wanting to make a point against gangster rap, but it also seems slightly misinformed and misguided. Not that I'm saying he didn't know anything about other music that was going on at the time, but it's a weird kind of point to make on a record that is so inward looking rather than focused on broader social issues. So even when he talks about religion and stuff, or sex, for example, it's very much about how that affects the narrator on the album and what he's feeling, what he's thinking, not necessarily wider society. So I think musically it doesn't necessarily stand out because it's like 1.5 minutes or something. But I mean, there's some interesting ideas behind it. It's perhaps a failed stab at doing that kind of thing. And it seems like something of an afterthought. And I don't think they really perform it live ever anymore. So it's kind of like, where does it even sit in Nine Inch Nails songs,
We get to these final 5 tracks. This is, for me, my favorite portion of the album. Starting with A Warm Place. Yeah, A Warm Place, it puts me into a trance. I mean, it's such a beautiful piece. Yeah. It's a calming instrumental, or is it? What is Trent trying to get across with this track and its place among the other songs on the album, particularly as it transitions into the next track, which is Eraser?
I think I know what you're going for here. It's that it's really ambient, driven like more by synth and keys, and it's a strange reprieve from everything. But is it really a reprieve? Is it really something that's more unsettling in that it takes the ear down a listening rabbit hole and it takes you in a certain direction, but it's a sleight of hand, and it's actually setting you up for a fall, like you say, and for more torment and challenge to come. So it's a breather, and maybe Reznor thought that had to be in there on the album so that the listener and the audience could step back and say, well, I actually feel I feel better for a moment, and I've like got some things off my chest and I've cleared my head. Right, let's see where this goes next.
That's interesting. You look at it so I view it differently. Like, I think of times when I go into a depression, and there are times when you just get to that point where everything is calm and you're just, you know what, I give up. I'm done. I'm just going to give into the downward spiral, and that's it. I'm not even going to fight it anymore. That's what I think when I hear that. It's kind of like, you just lying in a dark room and just been like, screw it. But then something pulls you back up and you move forward. But you talk about the David Bowie influence on this album. The track Reptile is, according to author Chris O'Leary, a sideways sequel to the alienated freakery of Bowie's 1980 track Scary Monsters. David Bowie has an influence on Trent, and particularly this album and this track in particular. Can you talk about that David Bowie influence?
It's interesting. I think we were talking about albums that influenced Reznor earlier. I think Scary Monsters was actually his kind of like gateway Bowie album, and then he worked back through the other records to something like Low, which really sits on top of this album as like a mood piece and a mixture of ambient instrumental tracks and then like more poppier immediate things. But broadly, it's almost like a neo blues, like futurist neo blues album, where he's lamenting a previous situation of drug addiction and feeling trapped and staying inside all day. And those two things kind of coupled of like keeping a low profile, but also being very depressed and being trapped in addiction. But addiction was the way in which he was living and surviving, so to speak. So caught in that vicious cycle. And I think Reptile has some of the influence of Scary Monsters because it's about people perhaps exploring their worst selves and the worst behaviors that they exhibit and indulging in that and becoming something of a monster and broken. And perhaps that's sometimes through the influence of drugs, or it might be through a partner or people who you have around you, negative people. But yeah, being brought down by those kind of things and then expressing that into the world and perhaps putting that onto other people. So making you display, like I say, your worst self, really.
Trent opened for David Bowie, right? 9 Inch Nails supported Bowie on the 95, 96 tour. And they became friends too. They became good friends.
Yeah, deep friends, yeah.
I would think Bowie certainly appreciated Trent's work. And in fact, if you listen to Bowie's music in the 90s, he was influenced by a lot of these guys that looked up to him.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's a really big influence. It's funny they end up touring together, right? There's a really big influence on the One Outside album from so much that Trent was doing. And I wouldn't say like he ripped him off, but I think like he was like, oh, this is really something I can tap into and explore in my own way. But I mean, I wonder if he would have actually done that if it hadn't been for people like 9 Inch Nails.
Yeah, I think of the Bowie song, I'm Afraid of Americans.
Yeah. Over in, a couple of years later in 97. And that's like, for loads of people, that's like one of their favorite David Bowie songs. It's really interesting.
So let's get this out of the way. What is Reptile, or who is Reptile about? Is it Courtney Love? He says it's not. Trent has said, no, it's not. He's always denied that. Yeah. You say it's unlikely about her, right? That's what you write in the book. It's unlikely about her.
Yeah, I think it like on the surface, it would make loads of sense. And it would be a brilliant coincidence that there's this monstrous, vicious, beautiful female harpy type creature. And for a lot of people, that conforms to their image of someone like Courtney Love. And I think for Reznor, it's just much more of a coincidental thing that they were friends, maybe had a relationship. He toured briefly with Hole, but a lot of that seems to have come after this record. So I think he might have known her before as a person, but I don't think he would have necessarily done, an assassination job against her on a song. Although there is the Starfuckers track from The Fragile, and the video for that seems to literally display a peroxide blonde type Courtney Love figure, but then perhaps she fits into some kind of archetype there, like the advancement of Marilyn Monroe, but gone dark and a bit goth, dare I say. It's never resolved, and I just don't know what the truth of all that was, so I didn't want to put anything too incriminating into the book.
The title track, it's thought to include a sample from the atmospheric landscape scenes of the film Alien. Which sound or sounds are we listening for here? I've seen Alien, but it's been a while. I may have seen it once or twice, but
yeah, I think it's literally ambient space sound, which seems like a really weird generic thing to slot into quite a quiet song. But I think he saw it as like, oh, this is interesting. This is obviously naturally atmospheric, and I use it as a background texture behind the downward spiral.
So it's throughout the whole track?
I believe so. Yeah, I believe so. I'm sure musicologists could give it to you much better, but I mean, sometimes I'm happier not knowing these things. Like he mentioned it, or it's listed as a sample in there, and I kind of like listen out for it and feel it where it is in it. But I mean, it's really interesting because like Alien as a movie really fits in with, and H.R. Geiger's work and design and stuff really fits into the aesthetic of the downward spiral and the mood, and things like Reptile, funnily enough, the xenomorph creature. It's all kind of there, but it doesn't necessarily have to be answered. I like the idea that these things can kind of exist parallel and not necessarily have to have a direct correlation.
I'd love to pull apart these tracks from this album and just see how many different instruments there are, how many different sound effects there are. Because there's so many layers to this. There's so many little things. Yeah, I mean, it's actually, this might be best listened to with headphones on too, because you're listening for little things here and there. He might be he may have put stuff in there that we haven't even heard yet. Maybe it's buried deep within some underneath an instrument or a vocal. Yeah.
One of the nice things Reznor said about the mix was that he wanted people to, because it's a challenging record, he knew that, but he wanted people to listen through it a few times. And he's thinking like, I like the idea that on the fifth time they'll hear something else, they'll appreciate another thing, they'll see more of like a dynamic shift in a particular part of the mix, and that people would like get more from the record and see that it was such a deeper embedded kind of thing rather than just, I mean, like, the most basic pop music can have loads of overdubs and layers in there, but you don't necessarily get more from it each time you hear it. You kind of get more of the same. And I think Reznor was saying that he wanted people to get deeper and deeper into the record the more they listen to it. And I think that's been borne out by people's, listening experience of it.
Title track, as you point out in the book, it's more of a segue into the final track, Hurt, which is one of Trent's all-time greatest songs. And you say it's the album's moment of near redemption. The narrator has become truly empowered by allowing self-forgiveness and absolution. He's shed his public persona skin and is now accepting of himself, warts and all here. Is that a good assessment?
Potentially. Yeah. It's once again, like a lot of the record, it's ambiguous and we don't know exactly who is talking and to whom they're talking, or whether it's just obviously internal monologue again. But I mean, for me, it seems to be the point at which the person relents and they're beaten, and you could even say that they've lost in the situation of recovery or finding a way out of their own mental or personal difficulties. But they also seem to let go of a lot of their anger and their hatred. And in that, there's like a calm and expressive calming that when they can at least appreciate the reality of what is in front of them, rather than pushing forward in denial and anger and lashing out, that they get to some kind of better place, even if it's just acceptance. And I don't know if that's a bittersweet, sad, painful thing. Certainly the song seems to suggest that, because the person is thwarted. And it offers a suggestion, if I could start again, I would come back like this and this. And it almost sounds like kind of like the Junkies' lament of, it's like, oh, but this time I'll get clean and everything will be okay and stuff. And you might get clean and you might recover and try to rebuild things, but you perhaps have got too many broken relationships or made too many mistakes in the past that you can't go back to an original good place where you started from. People can change and progress and stuff, but they can't necessarily fix or repair what's happened.
What a perfect way to end the album. Actually, I'm thinking of this now, just as you're talking about this track. The guitar parts of this track are Velvet Underground-like, slightly off key.
Yeah. It's a good call.
I'm thinking of, I think it's the song Heroin from Velvet Underground.
Definitely. Like, it's like almost jangling, really pull on your ear,
Yeah, and obviously Hurt became even bigger when Johnny Cash covered it. When you listen to this album today, has your perception or interpretation of it changed from the time you first heard it years ago?
I want to joke and say like, oh, I can't listen to it anymore. It's too much. But no, I still really like it. And like I bought, when I was doing the book as partly research, I bought the vinyl remaster from like 2017, and it's really, really fucking good. Like really high fidelity. I mean, people like love to go on about LPs and stuff, but it's just the work that was done on it made it really clear and really intense. So it's quite a pleasure to just stick that on, because it's two records, because it's really, I don't know what the term is, but when it's high fidelity, it's like really good grooves. So you only get like 3 tracks on each side rather than, a whole album on one physical LP. So it's like, you do like 3 tracks and you got to like flip the record and stuff. So it's really good quality and really immersive, and it's just a proper listening experience,
Are there any lyrics that you think differently of now than back then? That as we get older, we view things differently. We receive things differently. It's like watching a movie, like watching an old Hitchcock movie, and you watch it again 10 years later, 20 years later, and you're relating to different characters.
I think Ask Me in 20 Years. Haha.
All right.
And I think like stuff like Hurt, really sink and seep in there as well. And I think sometimes maybe with more experience and, dare I say growth, I don't know if I can, but change, you might look back on some of the anger and stuff as not immature, but something that you've outgrown and moved on from, and like blaming culture and hostility towards external influences. Whereas being, dare I say, like maybe a bit wiser, you can let go of some of those things, or say, I've resolved that and I've dealt with that, and I no longer have those same questions and issues. So yeah, I think it's one of those albums you really like grow up with. And I think I definitely appreciate it more now than when I was younger. But it just, hearing it for the first time and second, third time was like, it just struck you so much as like a sonic experience. And so you'll never quite be back there as when it was all brand new.
And it was a huge hit, commercial success. Why do you think it was such a huge success, to Trent's surprise? You read about the timing being just right when it comes out.
Oh, yeah, good call. I think I wouldn't say it like, took over from Nirvana, but I think with the death of Kurt Cobain and people knowing that there was no more music forthcoming from there, I think it was really the start at which alternative music became big business through to 99. And just, American alternative rock music just became huge and more popular and more in the mainstream charts, whereas before it'd been much more of an underground alternative thing, except for perhaps people like Nirvana. And obviously you had like more like the metal end of that, like Alice in Chains and Soundgarden and stuff, but this was something slightly different. And obviously the kind of music Reznor was doing that wasn't the standard 4/4-piece rock band format, and the deeper use of technology and production techniques and crossover perhaps really kind of paved the way for more future music beyond, the 90s.
And these days, Nine Inch Nails is still going, and Trent is also making music for film.
Yeah, he recently got his second soundtrack Oscar for the Disney Pixar film Soul, along with his long-term collaborator, now bandmate Atticus Ross and John Baptiste. So that was a group effort, so to speak. And then he's been able to do, or at least he's been able to set up tours for this year, whereas he couldn't before. And he's slotting into more festival slots, I think, because Foo Fighters had to pull out, and then he's playing in the UK, which is really exciting. And so just getting back on the road with the band, but I'm sure there'll be another album. I really liked the trilogy of EPs. Not everyone's favorite, but just showed really good range and really interesting and, much more engaging and also demanding than things like The Slip and perhaps With Teeth, which people really like, but they're a bit more modern rock format, whereas those three EPs showed like something really different and more experimental.
The book is called Into the Never, 9 Inch Nails and the Creation of the Downward Spiral. People can get a copy on Kindle, paperback, through all the usual places, right? Amazon?
Yep, sure.
And social media pages. Any that you want to get out there for fans to reach out to?
Yeah, sure. I mean, do you know what? If they just Google Adam Steiner, Adam Steiner, it's really cool. I come up top of the list now, apart from this like Battletech guy.
Oh, yeah.
From the
you're
90s.
Right. Yeah.
It's this little figurine, and he's not my nemesis, but he's like my alter ego. And it's really funny to get mixed up with this little fella.
Oh, yeah. Battletech Wiki.
Yeah. But yeah, it's all just out there to Google and to find what you want to find. I'm on social media stuff. Please don't expect anything great from me. I'm not that funny or interesting. I've got a dog and a toddler and so on, like everyone else.
Well,
it's all about the book.
It's all about the book. Yeah, I'll put links up to your social media pages. But yeah, I told you, it's just a brilliant book. It's one of those books that you can go back and listen to the album and think differently as you listen through it. Adam, thanks so much.
Thank you, Eric.
Thanks as always for listening. I'm Eric Senich, and join me again next time for another brand new episode of Booked on Rock.